And now the Trudeau government wants to reinstate the provision, probably to, let's say, create more tools for either left-wing activists or the government itself to stifle speech that is critical of the government or that is, let's say, right of center.
Alexa Lavoie for Rebel News, currently in Montreal, and today I'm accompanied by Samuel Bachand, GCCF Director for French Canada for the Network of the Legal Center for Constitutional Freedom. On December 1st, Mr. Bachand presented by Zoom the French version of the workshop on contemporary threat to freedom of expression in Canada. The English version will be present on December 6th. In this workshop, Mr. Bachand explained the threat caused by Bill C-11 and Bill C-36. For those who don't know about C-11, it's an act to amend the Broadcasting Act and therefore to regulate all content on the internet. Bill C-36 is an act to amend the Criminal Code, the Canadian Human Rights Act, and to make related amendment to another act in relation to hate propaganda, hate crime, and hate speech. We are here to follow up on the workshop offered by GCCF and to ask questions of interest to the future of Canadian, but also to the future of content creator and to the independent media by the government. Don't forget to sign our petition in large number if you haven't already done so against this liberal censorship at stopthecensorship.ca. So, Mr. Bachand, can you explain to us Bill C-11 and Bill C-36? It's two threats for the censorship in Canada. So what is your point of view on this?
Yes, so Bill C-11 was broadly advertised by our government as being a tool for Canadian creators, Canadian artists, to get some money from platforms such as Netflix and others. So that was let's say, the main sale argument. But we are worried that other items or provisions in Bill C-11, which do not pertain to that mechanism, will allow the CRTC to control or regulate speech on platforms and directly regulate certain contents which are not usually regulated by the states, so political content, religious content, scientific content, etc. You'll find in Bill C-11 provisions that would enable the CRTC to take or assume jurisdiction over any content which can potentially generate revenue. So not strictly commercial content, but any content at all. It can be created and posted by a local church, for instance. But if that content can potentially, directly or indirectly, generate a revenue for the person or the user who's posting it, then the CRTC could theoretically regulate it. And when the CRTC regulates, it is bound by policy objectives, which are found in the Broadcasting Act. You'll find in there objectives such as promotion of LGBT content, racialized content, etc., etc. So it doesn't apply everywhere in the same way, but the overall policy objectives remain. So if the CRTC starts to regulate broadly kinds of speech that are usually perfectly free, you'll find over time that the regulations will favor or will promote the policy objectives, and it can be detrimental, I think, to the freedom of expression of the users of the platforms, the streaming platforms. So it's one thing to say Netflix should add more Canadian content or pay a certain amount every year for Canadian creators and all that. It's a wholly other thing to start regulating criticism of COVID management by the federal government or the provincial governments, for instance. So yes, that's the main issues we have or we found with Bill C-11. Bill C-36 is, well, it was tabled. It died on the books, if I may say like that, at the end of the previous legislature, just before the new government was elected. However, the government has entrusted a group of so-called experts to suggest modifications or amendments, changes to the bill so it can be brought back and potentially adopted. Bill C-36 was called the Online Harms Bill. It was aimed or targeted at fighting so-called hate speech. So it takes a definition of hate speech that is, let's say, pretty standard, provided by the Supreme Court in the 90s and the 2000s, and it broadens a bit the meaning of that word, hate or hate speech. In Bill C-36, you'll find, for instance, an amendment to the criminal code allowing judges, on request of anybody, not just the Crown, to issue, let's say, restraining orders against people that are suspected to be about to utter hate speech. You can expect a flurry of motions and applications in court if that amendment is adopted. The restraining order under Section 810 of the Criminal Code is usually more appropriate. Is more appropriate for violent crimes, sexual delinquency or crimes. So to add potential or imminent hate speech to that seems to be a bit strange, or to change the nature of that process or that provision. Bill C-36 also contains amendments to the Canada Human Rights Act. So it would enable the Canada Human Rights Tribunal to issue orders and financial condemnations, economic, money, damages basically, against people who utter hate speech or transmit hate speech through telecommunications. That section existed for many decades, from 1977 to 2008. It didn't work very well. It was used mainly by activists, and it was instrumentalized by those activists to fight their personal battles and all that. And it's to have courts or tribunals involved in that is never a good idea, I think. And in 2008, the Harper government abrogated the provision, partly because groups and lobbies who, at the outset in the 70s and 80s, supported Section 13, now found that they were actually more harmed by it than protected by it. So it was abrogated. And now the Trudeau government wants to reinstate the provision, probably to, let's say, create more tools for either left-wing activists or the government itself to stifle speech that is critical of the government or that is, let's say, right of center.
What the Canadian will face when we look at the external content, intern content in Canada, but also if it's been approved and accepted to the Senate and in the Chamber, how they will be able to push back afterwards? Well,
first we can still put some pressure on the senators because they are in the last phase of either amending Bill C-11, which would send it back to the Commons, which would be a good thing. Or if that doesn't work and the bill remains intact, it will be adopted and come into force. And then what we can do is, well, watch the CRTC and intervene, participate in the CRTC's process and hearings when the CRTC wishes to adopt policies that tend to alter or, let's say, intervene in the content management of platforms such as YouTube, Rumble, etc. So that's one thing we can do. And then if the regulatory policies that we fear are adopted and that those policies are in breach of, let's say, freedom of speech, we can go challenge them before civil courts. So that is one thing we can do. Bill C-11 creates or enables the CRTC to force platforms to increase the discoverability of Canadian content. And, discoverability of content on a platform, when you go and type keywords on the search engine, well, it's a zero-sum game. So what you'll find is that if platforms are forced to increase the discoverability of Canadian content or any other content, say, such as pro-LGBT, pro-Black Lives Matter or the equivalent, then you'll find that other contents, which include contents that are, let's say, critical of those agendas, well, will be harder to find. So it's the same phenomenon as what we already see on Facebook or on YouTube, in terms of shadow banning.
Mm-hmm. So it's like, think like us, don't think differently.
Well, that's what it amounts to. Mm-hmm. In the end, I don't want to... As we say in French, l'enfer est pavé de bonnes intentions. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So I don't really care about intentions. It's the acts that speak for themselves and the results in the real world, the practical results. Well, look, the first thing is that if platforms make money with Canadian content, Canadian creators should benefit from that economically. So that's one thing, and let's leave it aside for a moment. In terms of increasing the discoverability of Canadian content, especially artistic content, I think now we're getting into more dangerous territory, simply because freedom tends to help the content that is high quality. Mm-hmm. So, in Canada, we have a very strong artistic milieu or artistic milieus who produce excellent content, and that's been the case for decades. And the reason for which many Canadian artists and creators have been successful is the sheer quality of what they do. It's not because government helped them in this or that way. It's simply because they're good. And we have a culture, socially speaking, that fosters good art. So having a government intervene and, let's say, disfavor certain, let's say, out of Canada content just to help the Canadian creators does not seem to me like a really helpful policy. I think those of our Canadian artists who are good will succeed anyway, and those who are not good, there are few, I expect, will not succeed. Mm-hmm. And that's just how life is.
So if you agree like us that Bill C-11 is a real threat to the freedom of speech freedom of expression in Canada. Please go and sign massively our petition at stopthecensorship.ca. It's really important. It's your future and what you can see online.